Part 1 of this series explored the question around China choosing a quarantine around Taiwan instead of an invasion or blockade. The use of a quarantine is a law enforcement operation versus a military operation if China chooses a blockade or an invasion of the island. The US and its allies in the Western Pacific have been preparing a series of agreements and military alliances to counter the ever-increasing military aggression of China. Even in modern times, China has embraced the use of grey zone tactics, and imposing a quarantine around Taiwan would be a continuation of this strategy. This tactic, which blurs the line between war and peace, would leverage the authority of law enforcement to implement a plan to seize the island and integrate it into the People's Republic of China, fulfilling the One China policy without resorting to military force. This poses a serious challenge for the US and its allies to attempt to find a non-military response to China's actions. The first option is for the United States and its allies to respond to a quarantine using military force. This could involve sinking or scattering the Chinese Coast Guard and its plan, People's Liberation Army Navy, support, thereby breaking the quarantine. The potential for a shooting war with China is the immediate drawback. It is unlikely that the United States will have any shoot-first supporters and must fight the war alone. It would be harder and riskier for the United States to do this without allies like Japan and the Philippines. It is unlikely that this option will be seriously considered as the first response. The second option is to use its own law enforcement functions to enforce Taiwan's laws and escort cargo ships in and out of Taiwanese waters. This would require that the Taiwanese Coast Guard maneuver an escort around a much more numerous Chinese Coast Guard and China's maritime militia. Both Chinese organizations, as seen in the West Philippine Sea, are more than willing to ram ships that enter what they regard as their territorial waters. Due to the need to repair damaged vessels, the outnumbered Taiwanese Coast Guard would eventually run out of ships, significantly slowing down the process of escorting cargo ships into and out of Taiwanese ports. This would mean that Taiwan would suffer economic damage to its trade-based economy, which is one of China's primary goals during the quarantine. A third option is to use military aircraft or contracted civilian aircraft to fly into Taiwan and bring in and fly out supplies from the nation. While this can assist in meeting specific needs, the airlift capacity is woefully insufficient to supplant the goods transported by large container ships into and out of Taiwan ports, which are crucial to international trade in general and Taiwan specifically. A fourth option is to not do anything to break the quarantine, but enact a trade embargo with China that would require the cooperation of Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, the European Union and the United States, including the NAFTA partners of Mexico and Canada. The plan is to economically cripple China by prohibiting the import of Chinese-made goods and preventing any container ship that stops in China from entering the ports of the international partners. There would also need to be a customs regime set up to prevent any Chinese goods from being purchased and imported into these countries through a third party, as well as China from importing goods through a third party. There are many drawbacks to this option, as it would create economic pain for all the countries involved, not just China. Furthermore, it is highly unlikely that such a coalition would form to oppose China. The EU has a larger GDP than the United States, but such a policy requires unanimous consent, and it is doubtful that the EU would consent to such a policy. If the EU or Japan did not participate in supporting the United States, this policy would likely fail quickly. Another issue is that it does not provide relief to Taiwan and leaves it to its own devices, which could lead to the Chinese abandoning the quarantine and launching an invasion, if the US and its allies could potentially ruin the Chinese economy. This would lead to a war in the Western Pacific over Taiwan. The fifth option under consideration involves the US emulating the United Kingdom's strategy during the Falklands War in 1982, where the Royal Navy successfully deployed civilian ships with British registry to support an operation spanning 8,000 miles or 13,000 kilometres. This allowed the Royal Navy to increase its cargo capacity to support a military operation that was 3,500 miles or 5,600 kilometres from the nearest friendly port. Operation Earnest Will in 1988 served as an example for the US, during which the US reflagged Kuwaiti oil tankers to fly the US flag. The United States Navy escorted these vessels to protect them from Iranian attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. This was part of Iran's ongoing war against Iraq, known as the Tanker War. An attack on a US-flagged ship would be considered an attack on the United States as a warning to Iran and Iraq not to attack tankers flying the US flag and under US Navy escort. There are not enough US-flagged ships that can carry the cargo required to maintain the volume of commerce passing through Taiwan's ports, but it would be an option. The Chinese Coast Guard would face a challenge in attempting to halt a US-flagged ship that is under escort. The US could also try to reach an agreement with international cargo carriers to allow the reflagging of their ships under the US flag to allow them access to the Taiwan ports with a US Navy escort. The problem lies in the likelihood of not allowing these reflagged ships to enter Chinese ports. As a result, these carriers would need to divide their fleet of international cargo-carrying ships between those permitted to visit Chinese ports and those restricted to Taiwan ports. This decision would be based on their business model, which aims to mitigate the risk to their ships and address the rising insurance costs. Most likely, these international carriers will choose to remain neutral, likely reject the US request, and be willing to submit to China's quarantine rules to avoid a conflict and a risk to their ships. This would not impact the US-flagged ships that the US can muster, but it would lack the capacity to keep Taiwan economically viable. The other issue is that US-flagged ships being escorted by the US Navy could lead to the plan being involved, and this would increase the risk of war with US Navy ships being vulnerable so close to Chinese mainland air cover. The sixth and final option to be considered is for the United States to enact something like the Carter Doctrine in Taiwan. The Carter Doctrine declared in 1980 that the Persian Gulf and its flow of oil were in the US national interest and that the US would use military force to defend this national interest. The US can declare that Taiwan is in the US national interest and that it would defend its national interest with military force if necessary. The US must declare this before China declares a quarantine over Taiwan. This option has the drawback of eliminating US strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan's defense. This unambiguously commits the United States to defending Taiwan as part of its national interests. The other drawback is that it escalates tensions with China by directly challenging the One China policy, China's assertion that Taiwan is an internal matter, and China's declaration that the international community should not interfere in China's domestic affairs. The upside of this controversial decision is that it would basically eliminate the quarantine option for China, because any violation of this new Taiwan doctrine would require a military response. So, whether it is a Chinese Coast Guard operation or a plan-led operation, the response will be a military one. The declaration of the doctrine by China would trigger a war with the US. The US must also consult with its Western Pacific allies to assess the likelihood of receiving support from them, or if it should proceed independently in such an endeavour. This certainly is not an exhaustive list of potential US and allied responses to the Chinese grey zone tactic of establishing a quarantine around Taiwan, as there are potentially other options or variations of these options. This is meant to demonstrate that there are few good options for responding to a quarantine that does not lead to war or the eventual absorption of Taiwan into mainland China. This is why the US is justifiably concerned about a quarantine and how it could possibly do all its work to form alliances to deter China as inert. The other issue is that Taiwan may decide to launch a military assault against China, choosing to risk a Chinese attack and potential invasion over a slow strangulation of the island. This could also lead to eventual involvement by the US and its allies, but this would be less clear, since in this case Taiwan initiated the hot war. There is no doubt that an amicable resolution of the Taiwanese issue is unlikely anytime soon, and it will remain a global flashpoint.